Margaret had been walking for 3 days when the snow began. Her husband had died in the spring, the farm had been taken by the bank in the summer, and by autumn, she had nothing left but a small bag of belongings and a pair of boots that were already wearing thin. She had been told there was work in the valley, a town called Silver Creek, where a woman could find a job, a place to sleep, a reason to wake up in the morning. But the trail had disappeared beneath the snow, and the landmarks she had been following had vanished, and now she was walking through a world that had turned white and silent and endless. The wind picked up as the sun went down, and with it came the cold, a cold that bit through her coat, through her dress, through the skin beneath. She had never felt anything like it. The snow was no longer falling from the sky. It was coming from everywhere, from the ground, from the trees, from the air itself, swirling around her in a dance that had no end. She could not see her hands in front of her face. She could not hear her own footsteps. She was blind and deaf and alone, and she knew, with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone, that she was going to die. She stumbled into the house by accident. Her foot caught on something buried in the snow, a step, perhaps, or a threshold, and she fell forward, her hands breaking the fall against a wooden floor. She lay there for a moment, gasping, her face pressed against the cold boards, and then she lifted her head and looked around. She was inside. There were walls around her, a roof above her, a floor beneath her. The wind was still howling, but it was muffled now, distant, as if the house were pushing it away. She had found shelter. She had found a place to die that was not the open snow. She crawled to the corner of the room, dragging her bag behind her, and curled into a ball, her knees against her chest, her arms wrapped around herself. The cold was still there, seeping through the walls, creeping across the floor, but it was not as sharp as it had been outside. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, tried to forget where she was, tried to pretend that she was somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere safe. But the cold would not let her sleep, and the fear would not let her rest, and she lay there in the darkness, waiting for the end. She heard the noise sometime in the night, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a breath, not hers. Something else, something alive, something that was sharing the darkness with her. Her eyes flew open, and she pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She listened, straining to hear over the wind, and there it was again. A slow, steady breathing, coming from the other side of the room. She was not alone. She had never been alone. "Who's there?" Her voice was a whisper, cracked and thin, barely audible over the storm. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. She waited, her hand reaching blindly for something to use as a weapon, finding nothing but dust and splinters. Then a voice came out of the darkness, low and rough, the voice of a man who had not spoken in a long time. "Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you." She did not move. She did not breathe. "Who are you?" The voice was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke again. "Someone who got lost." "Same as you." He did not come near her. He stayed on his side of the room, and she stayed on hers, and the storm raged between them, invisible but present. She learned his name was Eli, and she learned that he had been a trapper, that he had been caught in the storm 3 days ago, that he had found the house the same way she had, by falling into it. He had no food, no fire, no way to signal for help. He had been sitting in the darkness, waiting to die, when she had fallen through the door. "I thought I was imagining you," he said. She almost laughed. "I thought I was imagining you too." The cold grew worse as the night wore on. Margaret could feel her fingers growing numb, her toes losing feeling, her thoughts beginning to slow. She knew what was happening. She had seen it before, in the winters on the farm, when the old ones would sit by the fire and talk about the ones who had frozen to death in the storms. It was supposed to be peaceful, they said. You got sleepy, and then you stopped feeling anything, and then you died. She was getting sleepy. She was starting to feel nothing. She was dying, "You still awake over there?" His voice came out of the darkness, and she forced her eyes open. Barely. She heard him move, heard the scrape of his boots on the floor, and then he was beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face close to hers in the darkness. "You can't sleep," he said. "You know that. If you sleep, you won't wake up." She knew. She had known. But knowing and doing were different things, and her body was no longer listening to her mind. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but you have to stay awake." "We both do." He talked to her through the night. He told her about his life, about the cabin he had built in the mountains, about the wife who had died of fever, about the years he had spent alone because he could not bear to be around people who reminded him of what he had lost. She told him about her husband, about the farm, about the bank that had taken everything. They talked about things they had never told anyone, secrets they had carried for years, fears they had buried so deep they had forgotten they were there. And as they talked, the cold receded, pushed back by something that was not fire but was warm all the same. The storm lasted 3 days. They spent them in the tiny house, huddled together for warmth, sharing the last of Margaret's bread, melting snow in a tin cup she had found in her bag. They talked until there was nothing left to say, and then they sat in silence, listening to the wind, waiting for it to end. On the third morning, the sun broke through the clouds, and the world outside was white and still and beautiful. Eli opened the door, and the light poured in, blinding them both. They stood in the doorway, blinking, and for the first time, they saw each other's faces. He was younger than she had expected, his face weathered but not old, his eyes the color of the sky after a storm. He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that she had not seen in a long time. Not pity, not hunger, recognition. He saw her, the way she had been seen by her husband before the fever took him, the way she had thought she would never be seen again. She looked away, embarrassed, but he reached out and took her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me sleep." She looked at him and she smiled. "Thank you for the same." They walked out of the canyon together, following the tracks he had made before the storm, the ones that had been buried but not erased. The snow was deep, the walking was hard, but they did not stop. They talked as they walked, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. He told her about the town where he traded his furs, a place called Willow Creek, a day's walk from the canyon. She told him about Silver Creek, the town she had been trying to find, the job she had been hoping to get. He shook his head. "Silver Creek is 2 days the other way. You were going the wrong direction." She stopped walking, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. 2 days the other way. She had been walking away from the only chance she had. She had nothing left, no food, no money, no hope. She sank down into the snow, her legs giving out beneath her, and she put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too tired for tears. She simply sat there, waiting for him to leave, waiting for him to go on without her. He did not leave. He sat down beside her in the snow and waited. "You could come with me," he said after a long silence. She looked up at him, confused. "To Willow Creek. It's not much. A few stores, a saloon, a boarding house. But there's work. A woman could find a place there." She stared at him, trying to read his face, trying to understand what he was offering. "Why would you help me?" He shrugged, a small gesture, almost shy. "Because you helped me. Because we kept each other alive in that house. Because I don't want to go back to being alone." He looked at her, and his eyes were steady. "And because I think you're someone worth knowing." She went with him. She told herself it was because she had nowhere else to go, because Willow Creek was closer than Silver Creek, because she needed food and shelter and a chance to rest. But when they reached the town, when she saw the small houses and the dusty streets and the people who nodded at Eli as they passed, she knew it was not just about convenience. It was about him, the man who had sat with her in the darkness, who had talked to her through the longest night of her life, who had held her hand when she was too cold to hold it herself. She had not been looking for him. She had not been looking for anyone. But he was there, and she was there. And the storm that had tried to kill them had brought them together instead. He found her a room at the boarding house, paid for a week with the money he had saved from his furs. He brought her food from the store, wood for the fire, a blanket that was thicker than the one she had been carrying. She watched him as he moved around the room, his hands busy, his face serious, and she felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought was dead. She pushed it away, told herself it was gratitude, told herself it was relief, told herself it was anything but what it really was. She was not ready. She might never be ready. But her heart did not care what she was ready for. He came to her on the 7th night, after the week she had paid for had run out. She was sitting by the window, watching the stars, wondering where she would go tomorrow when she heard his knock on the door. She opened it, and he was standing there, his hat in his hands, his face nervous in a way she had not seen before. "I have something to ask you," he said. She stepped aside, let him in, and he stood in the center of the room, turning his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Eli?" He looked at her then, and his voice was rough. "I don't want you to leave." She stared at him, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. "I have nowhere to stay," she said. "The week is up. I can't afford." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and took her hands in his. "Stay with me," he said. "I have a cabin. It's small, but it's warm. It's not much, but it's mine. And I want you to be there. I want you to be there with me." She looked at him, at the man who had found her in the darkness, who had kept her awake when sleeping meant dying, who had walked her out of the storm and into a new life. "Why?" she whispered. He smiled, the first real smile she had seen on his face. "Because I love you. I think I loved you the moment you fell through that door." She did not answer him with words. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her, his face pressed into her hair, his arms tied around her back. They stood there in the small room, the fire crackling, the stars shining through the window, and for the first time in years, neither of them was alone. She had lost everything, her husband, her farm, her home. She had walked into a storm expecting to die, but the storm had not killed her. It had brought her to a tiny abandoned house, and in that house, she had found a man who was as lost as she was, as broken as she was, as desperate for something to hold on to. They had kept each other alive through the longest night, and now, in the quiet of the morning, they were building something new. Not a replacement for what they had lost. Something different. Something they had built together, from nothing, from the ashes of their old lives. The tiny house was still there, buried in the canyon, a monument to the storm that had tried to kill them. But they did not go back to it. They did not need to. They carried it with them, the memory of the darkness, the sound of each other's voices, the warmth of two bodies huddled against the cold. They had been strangers. They had been survivors. Now they were something more. They were home,